Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Gurney. I'm with Eagle's Environmental Support Division. I wanted to thank you all for joining us to talk about the Riverside Sand and Gravel Landfill and surrounding Millennium Park. I've got just a couple quick intro slides here before we get started, and then I'll hand it over to Abigail Hendershot. So first of all lines are muted during the webinar. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available to you to review afterwards. It'll be posted on our Eagle YouTube channel, hopefully within, I would say early next week. I know we've got some field work planned this week, so I'll be honest, it'll probably be early next week. Go ahead, Abby. Once we get to it, after the presentations tonight, we will have a question and answer portion. So to submit questions throughout the presentation, feel free to do that. There's a question and answer box in Zoom. You can use that function and submit questions throughout. We'll keep an eye on them and hopefully be able to, at the end of the session here, we'll try to get to all the questions that are sent in. You can also click on the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. So that'll raise your hand in Zoom. And that way you can ask your question out loud. I see we've got a couple folks that just dialed in. You can press pound or #2 on your phone, and that'll raise your hand, and then we can allow you to unmute yourself and you can ask the question there. So, and if Rosa, if you're available, you want to turn your camera and mic on, yeah, go for it there, Rosa.
Hola, bienvenidos. Si usted tiene alguna pregunta o duda y habla español o prefiere utilizar el idioma español, nosotros podemos traducirle. También podemos contestarle sus preguntas en español. Gracias.
Awesome. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Abigail Hendershot to introduce herself and kick it off here this evening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me all right?
Yep. Sound good.
Okay, excellent. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And as Mike said, we've got plenty of time for questions and answers. Go ahead and type them into the chat as we go through the night so that you can type your question as you're thinking about it. We can come back to them at the end. As Mike said, my name is Abby Hendershot. I'm the Executive Director for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Happy to be with you tonight. And tonight we're going to do a town meeting specifically on Riverside Sand and Gravel Landfill. And we will have Heidi Helenbach is our regional lead for the Grand Rapids office. She will be doing an MPART overview on PFAS basics. Rosa Hyman, who you just heard from, is from the Department of Health and Human Services. Rosa is going to talk to you about health and PFAS, and then Kent Walters is our project manager for the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and he'll be talking to you about the investigation area specifically. And then we'll come back, I'll come back at the very end and show you the MPART website, and then we will go through questions and answers and answer any of the questions that you have at this point. So let me start it off by getting to Heidi Helenbach. Heidi, all right, go ahead. Take it away, Heidi.
Thanks, Abby. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us on this very lovely evening. As Abby said, my name is Heidi Helenbach. I am the Grand Rapids District Supervisor for the Air Quality Division, but I'm also the Regional PFAS Lead for the district. So I'm just going to go over a quick review of MPART and then talk a little bit about PFAS in general. So MPART, as it says here, stands for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. It was created under a governor's executive order to ensure coordination amongst the 7 state agencies that are working on PFAS response. And this has led to a very unique and strategic approach to dealing with PFAS and really has put us ahead of all the other states in terms of dealing with this contaminant. With PFAS, with MPART directing the state's actions on all things PFAS, we've been really successful at quickly identifying and responding to PFAS contamination. Next slide, please, Abby. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS are a class of man-made compounds, and they are one of the strongest bonds in chemistry, the carbon-fluorine bond. And because of this bond, the compounds do not break down easily. PFAS act as surfactants. They are highly stable. They repel water, oil, fat, and grease. And the industry began developing PFAS in the 1940s. And to date, we have over 5,000, sometimes we hear 9,000 PFAS compounds. So why are we concerned about PFAS? Well, for one thing, they are widespread through the ecosystem, and that's really because they don't break down easily. They're very hard to get rid of. PFAS bioaccumulate, which means they build up in our bodies, in the bodies of fish and wildlife. Some of them may affect health, and our THHS toxicologists will talk a little bit more about that. There's just a bit of emerging science and information on these many compounds. We're just starting to really dig in and do research and learn more about them. And the lack of federal standards for cleanups has really made Michigan's process and cleanup standards even more important. So next slide. So why why do we see so much PFAS in the environment? Well, there have been a multitude of uses of PFAS, consumer uses throughout the years. Some include the waterproof apparel, cosmetics, protective coatings, non-stick pans like Teflon, food packaging, certain type of firefighting foam, you name it. A lot of products have PFAS. Next slide. So this picture shows how PFAS cycles through the environment. It can go from industrial process to the groundwater, to a stream or river, lake. Can discharge to a wastewater treatment plant, which are not designed to treat for PFAS, which then ends up discharging to water body. Some of the wastewater treatment plants have biosolids, which are land applied for farm fields, and they end up back into the soils, groundwater. It's a cycle that we are trying to better understand, and once we can do that, we can hopefully break this cycle. Another important aspect is drinking water, and a lot of citizens in the state are serviced by residential drinking wells. And one of the first steps when we identify a site is to check with our local health department and DHHS to see if there are any residential wells that need to be sampled. Next slide, please. This shows the 7 PFAS compounds that have cleanup criteria here in the state of Michigan. And I will let you take a look at those for a minute. They have been promulgated rather recently and done so to protect public health. Next slide. Michigan is now also looking for PFAS in our lakes and streams and in the fish population to help identify and eliminate sources of PFAS. Next slide. So to date, we have 212 sites where PFAS exceeds the cleanup criteria in the groundwater. These include military installations, landfills, industrial sites, and airports. We're currently investigating many more sites, and we prioritize these sites based on potential impacts to drinking water with the goal of protecting public health. Next slide. And lastly, I just want to mention the Citizens Advisory Work Group. It is comprised of residents from impacted communities, and it helps advise MPART. 2 key charges of the work group are to recommend how to better engage and empower communities that have been impacted, and to recommend how to educate the general public. The COG, as they're known, they have a website, and Abby will show you that at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Rosa. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Like Heidi said, my name is Rosa Jaiman. and I am a toxicologist for the Department of Health and Human Services. My contact information is over there. If you have any question, don't hesitate to send me an email or to call me. Next one, please. So I'm going to start talking about the role of Ndhs and the local health department. So our role is to understand the health concern facing your community. For this, we develop a plan to investigate and address the health risk. In this plan, EGLE leads the site investigation, and Ndhs and the local health department lead the public health planning and response. We also evaluate PFAS exposure to residents in the community, in where we recommend public health actions as needed. Next one, please. So how someone can be exposed to PFAS? A person can be exposed to PFAS by swallowing the PFAS or ingesting the PFAS. For example, by drinking contaminated water, by eating fish caught from water, contaminated by PFAS. So once we know that there are lakes or rivers that have PFAS, we sample those fish. And if the fish have levels of PFAS, especially PFOS, we know PFOS can bioaccumulate in fish, we issue the Eat Safe Fish guidelines for those specific rivers and lakes. Another way in which a person can be exposed to PFAS is by incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust. And we can see this most in children because of the hand-to-mouth behavior. Also by eating food packaged in material containing PFAS or using some consumer products. PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern. So people can keep using the water to clean their house, their dishes, to showering, or for any other recreational activities. Next one, please. So here we see a survey that was done by the CDC. What they discovered is that most people in the United States have some levels of PFAS in their blood. In this, we see a graph. They studied 4 different PFAS. They studied PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA. So the x-axis or the horizontal line represent the years, and the y-axis or the vertical line represent the concentration of those chemicals in their blood. What we see is that there is a decline of PFAS over time, especially for PFOS and PFOA. There is a decline of PFOS of around 80% and a decline of PFOA of around 60%. And we see this decline around 2002. And the reason is because industry that produce PFOS and PFOA reduce their production. So when you have less production of this contaminant, people are going to be less exposed. Therefore, they're going to have less amount of these contaminants in their blood. Next one, please. Now I'm going to talk about some health effects that have been associated with PFAS. Those ones are reduced fertility, high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, a small decrease in infant birth weight, high cholesterol, especially total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, also known as bad cholesterol. Other health effects that have been associated are thyroid disease, liver damage, decreased immune system response to vaccines, and developing certain type of cancer, in particular kidney and testicular cancer, and we see this one with PFOA. So if you have been exposed with PFAS, it doesn't mean that you are going to develop these health effects. Usually, someone has to be exposed to high amount of PFAS for a long period of time to be more likely than the average person to develop these health effects. Next one, please. So here we see Eat Safe Fish guideline for a water body that is near to the site, and this water body is a Grand River. So this is what you're going to see if you're looking for the Eat Safe Fish guideline. You will see the different type of fish. You will see the chemical of concerns, and you will see how much of these different fish you can eat per month depending of the size. Next one, please. So here we see the Grand River. What this image say is that fish, especially crab and catfish, were sampled in the Grand River, and the location is downstream of Grand Rapids. So the reason why we present this is that these fish were sampled. They have some levels of PFAS, in this case, PFAS. The reason why they are not in the slide that is out there that you just saw is because for crab and catfish, the contaminant of concern or the contaminant that is driving these guidelines is not PFAS. In this case, is PCB. Next one, please. So thank you again. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask. Now I'm going to let you with Ken Walters. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosa. As Rosa said, my name is Kent Walters. I'm with the Materials Management Division of Eagle, and I help manage landfills in the western part of Michigan. Next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with where the site is located, we'll start on the left side with a regional photo of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. The yellow star indicates where the site is located, so you can see how it's located in West Michigan. Zooming in a little bit closer to Grand Rapids area, you can see the site is located to the west, a little bit southwest of Grand Rapids. And then zooming in even further on the right image, you can see that the site is located in the northern part of what is known as Millennium Park. Next slide, please. So why sample for PFAS? Why did Eagle think it was important to sample this site for PFAS? And what I usually like to do is go back in time and take a look at what the landfill looked like back when it was, maybe early, when it was just getting started, or, earlier in its lifespan. And specifically in this photo that we're looking at is 1978. You can see how Millennium Park looks a lot different than what it does today. You can see that there's a lot less water. The site is still actively being mined for sand and gravel. There's a lot more wooded areas along site. It's just a good photo to show you how much activity there was in the site back in the day. That tan outline that you see on the map is representative of basically the extent of the landfill as it is today, at current day. And within that tan outline, you can see sort of a white blob, and that's sort of the indication of when the landfilling started. So it's probably mid 70s, late 70s when they started landfilling. And one thing you'll notice is, there's no liner on this landfill, which basically means there's nothing underneath the landfill to prevent any contamination or anything else from going out into the environment. From our historical records, we know that this landfill was primarily for construction and demolition landfill and for construction demolition wastes. And if you know where the site is, you know what you're looking at, you can see that there's a lot of huge concrete chunks and other concrete and construction demolition stuff that you can see next to the landfill or sticking out of the sides of the landfill. Some of our other historical documents indicate that there is some waste that probably shouldn't have been at this landfill. We have some historical records that show that there was some contaminated soils that were accepted. And we also have some information that shows that there was some drums of waste that had to be removed because they weren't authorized to be disposed of in this location. So another, well, you can flip back one more. So another thing that we look at in our historical information is historical groundwater information. And some of the historical groundwater information that we have shows that there's elevated concentrations of testing down gradient of the landfill compared to up gradient of the landfill. So that would give us some information that the landfill is having an impact to the environment. And another reason too that we want to look at the site is, a lot of things, that Heidi was walking through earlier in the presentation, a lot of the things that we throw away probably have some level of PFAS on it, low levels probably, but, maybe some level of PFAS on it. And when you take all that waste and you put it in one place, it kind of concentrates it and it just gives it more potential for it to leach off and then potentially get into the environment. So it's because of these reasons why we were concerned about the site and wanted to take a look at it and test it for PFAS. Next slide, please. So here's a map showing zoom in of the landfill with some sample results, and you'll see numerous things on this map. The circles on the map indicate, the small circles on the map indicate locations where groundwater samples were collected. The triangle indicates a location where a landfill leachate seep was sampled. What do I mean by landfill leachate seep? I'll imagine, you know, when it rains, some of that precipitation may work its way through the landfill, and sometimes that precipitation will, you know, follow various pathways, and it might come out the side of a landfill versus, you know, straight down. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. There's, you know, a wet spot next to the landfill that's usually always wet during the year, and that area was sampled for PFAS. It's representative of sort of the waste in the landfill and what potential PFAS is coming out of the landfill. So looking more specifically at the results, you'll see different colors. The red colors indicate locations where there was exceedances of criteria. The yellow dots indicate locations where there were detections, but not necessarily exceedances. And there's no green on this map, but that would indicate that there was no detections of PFAS. So looking at the groundwater samples on the southwest corner, where we have a groundwater sample, we have a detection of PFOS of 33 and PFOA at 20 parts per trillion. And if we compare that to our groundwater standards or our drinking water standards, we can see that that's above that recommended drinking water standard. Down in the southeast corner of the map, we have some concentrations where we detected PFAS, but nothing was above criteria. North of the landfill, we have one singular detection of PFBS, low level detection, nothing above criteria there either. And if you notice that blue arrow in the center of the map, you can see is pointing down. That's representative of groundwater flow. Historical documents indicate that groundwater basically flows from north to south in this region towards the lake just to the south. What this information is telling us is there's not really much, if any, PFAS coming onto the site, but we do have PFAS down gradient of the site. And so that gives us some confidence that, yeah, the landfill is probably contributing PFAS to the environment, and we can support that with that landfill leachate seep that we sampled, because that's also representative of what's coming out of the landfill and into the environment. So it does appear that this landfill is impacting groundwater with PFAS. And one other important thing to recognize at this site is that there are no identified drinking water wells down gradient at this site, so which is also good news. But we do have surface water that's basically the landfill sits in surface water, so that's a concern. Next slide, please. So speaking of surface water, that's something else we wanted to check out, not only because the landfill is there, but also historically, you know, the photo I showed earlier, it had a lot of activity. This area has had a lot of land use changes, a lot of activity with gravel mining. And, you know, if you've been to this park before, you'll notice that there's a lot of oil and gas activities going in this area. So it just made sense to take a look at the area as a whole, just to make sure that there is nothing else going on while we were out there collecting samples for the landfill related activities. So we collected 7 samples from 7 of the largest lakes in Millennium Park. 6 out of these 7 samples had detections of PFAS. The only one that was non-detect was up in that northwest corner, where you can see that non-detection, that ND for PFOA and PFOS. And if we look at the criteria that we compare it to on the left side of the figure, you can see for PFOA, we're looking at a criteria of 12,000 parts per trillion. And for PFOS, we're looking at 12 parts per trillion. And if we compare that to all the values on our map, we notice that none of the surface water samples are above any criteria, which is good news. If we look at the map in a little bit more detail, you could probably say that concentrations of PFAS to the east of Maynard Avenue are consistently higher than concentrations that are found on the west side of Maynard Avenue. And then that lake that is right next to landfill appears to have the highest concentrations, which generally makes sense because you would expect if there's a landfill that's leaking PFAS into that body of water, you probably expect also that that lake would have the highest concentrations. One other thing I'd like to point out is the Grand River was also sampled for PFAS in 2019, and you can see in the bottom left and top right corner of the images where those results are. And generally, those results are pretty consistent with what we're finding, or in the same range of detections that we're finding in the Millennium Park Riverside landfill, Riverside sand and gravel landfill area. Next slide, please. Another thing that we did was fish sampling. So on May 12 of 2022, the surface water assessment section went out and collected bluegill and pumpkin seed sunfish from 2 lakes. Those arrows are pointing to the 2 lakes that fish were collected from. And if you remember from the previous slide, that Northwest Lake, it had a non-detection of PFAS, and then that lake that's right next to the landfill had some of the higher concentrations of PFAS. So it could be a good comparison of what we might find in fish when we're comparing, a lake that doesn't have any detections versus a lake that does. One thing I'd also like to point out is that results may not be available for these fish samples until 2023. Next slide, please. So in order to wrap up this part of the presentation, just a quick summary. If you remember that there's waste disposal at Riverside Sand and Gravel Landfill and online landfill, we have historical information that shows groundwater impacts. One groundwater monitoring well and a leachate seep down gradient of the disposal area where it's an exceedance of cleanup criteria. All Millennium Park surface water samples were below water quality values. There's no potential drinking water wells down gradient of the landfill. And there's fish samples collected for PFAS analysis on May 12 of 2022. Some of the next steps that EGLE would be hoping that the property owners of the landfill would be taking steps to look at the information and to get a better handle of defining PFAS impacts next to the landfill, so that we can ensure that that the environment is protected and human healthy environment is protected. Next slide. And to wrap it up, this whole area is serviced by the City of Grand Rapids Community Water Supply. And just for people's information, they do annual sampling for PFAS, and the most recent annual sampling event that we have for April of 2021, there was only detection of PFOS at 2 parts per trillion. With that, I will pass it back to Abby.
All right, get myself unmuted here. Thanks, Kent. Let's see here if I can click on this. We're going to go and bring up the MPART website. So just a couple of things for everyone to know. This particular website page is our new landing page. We did change the state of Michigan website format, and so now all the departments are standardized, but this is the new MPART web page, and so it looks a little bit different, but it's got all the same basic stuff on it. Some of the things that we wanted to show you, obviously, here's the new Eat Safe Fish Guide information that we were telling you about. If you scroll down here, we have information on site investigations. All of our citizen advisory work group stuff is here. There's a public meeting calendar, so it's easy to find if you want to join one of our webinars or if you want to join our citizens advisory work group. And the other thing I'll just show you real quick is our PFAS sites of interest. So Kent was just talking about our sites. We have a what we call a PFAS geographic information system. And this, if you click on it, is a GIS mapper that has all of our sites. It has all of the purple triangles are the MPART sites. And so you can turn on the layers. PFAS sites are the purple triangles, all surface water sampling. So Kent just talks about that for Millennium Park, and then all of our state wide public water, community water supply sampling is there. So you can zoom into your area and look. So here is a lot of water sampling that was done along the Grand River, as well as a number of different MPART sites. So this particular one is our Riverside Sand and Gravel, and you can click on that and go to the MPART write-up for this particular page. So hopefully you've had a chance, and this should have, I'm looking for the map, Kent, it's not on here. Usually we will have a map to go with it. So that's in this particular thing, we did reorganize the page a little bit, but everything is still there. So let me just go to the public engagement page real quick before I give you back to Kent. We can open it up for questions. So go ahead and type your questions in. Our Citizens Advisory Work Group is here, and we have information on the charter, information on how to become a member, as well as our meeting materials that we've had. So we've had a number of different meetings this year. So all those information and presentations are there as well. So, all right, let me go back to the presentation. And I will go back to the meeting. And Mike, you want to take it back over, and I will put us on a map that we can talk from.
Yeah, great. So just as a reminder, again, we've got a few questions here in the question and answer. You're welcome to raise your hand if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question. And then for those of you that are on the phone, you can do the pound or the hash sign and then the number 2, and that'll raise your hand. For now, we've got a couple questions, like I said, in the question and answer. So the first one is related to health concerns. I'm always so bad at this, but I'm guessing this is going to Rosa. So if I'm wrong right off the bat, I won't do this again, but I'm guessing this is going to be a Rosa question. So when it comes to the health risks, how does that change if there's an exposure to PFAS that's below criteria? So how risky is it to be exposed to levels less than what our criteria currently is?
Well, thank you, Christine, for your question. So we have to know that these regulated levels are also health-based values. So if you are exposed to levels below the regulated levels, we don't expect to see a health concern. Even if you are exposed to levels that are at the regulated level or a little beyond, if you are exposed to that, will not necessarily mean that you are going to develop health effects. Again, usually people need to be exposed to high levels for a certain time or for a long period of time to be more likely than the average person to develop health effects.
Great, thank you. How are residents currently being notified about the work that's out here, the PFAS that's in the area? And is there a plan for continuing to keep local residents informed moving forward?
When we were doing outreach for this site, we reached out to all the surrounding cities to provide notification of what we were doing, and this provide notification of this this meeting. So we've been working with the cities around the site that surround and really all touch the site, because we would assume that a lot of the people that use the park would be located somewhere in these cities. So we've been working with cities to keep people informed, and hopefully they've been working to keep their constituents informed too.
Thank you. With the we have data here that shows that PFAS is present. By law, what is the property owner required to do, and by when, right? And so we have, even here, we have exceedances that are shown. Are there monitoring requirements? Are there treatment requirements? Are there removal requirements? So what are they required to do? And is there any sort of timeline schedule associated with that?
Yeah, so since this is a landfill that's regulated by Part 115, and just think of Part 115 as solid waste laws and regulations, there's specific requirements that if there's a documented release from a landfill then that landfill or the owner of that landfill has to do proper delineation, or they have to do testing to show where that PFAS is and basically the extent of where that PFAS is, so that we can be confident that the PFAS that is found out there isn't unnecessarily exposing people or the environment. So that'd be something that the landowners would have to be working on and to come up with a plan to do. As far as, let's see, what was the other, is there another part of the question for that, Mike?
Yeah, so obviously it sounds like they have to continue to do some sampling to delineate the current impacts. Are there any response activities that have to be conducted at this time? Are there any that they would have to do if they find something, a problem, if they find more PFAS, and is there a timeline, maybe in statute? Because I know that's really kind of what bounds us, right? Is statute. Is there a timeline in statute that they need to do that by?
There are some timelines that are outlined in the solid waste laws and regulation. But first, these samples are kind of the first initial look at the site, and we would want to work with the landowners to develop a work plan that makes sense moving forward. To like I said, develop a work plan that makes sense for the environment and the concentrations of PFAS that are found at the site. So we're not necessarily kicked in the timelines yet, but that likely will be coming depending on what further is what we find for in the future.
Great, thank you. I've got one question that I think will fit well with the slide you have up. So I'll do that, and then I know we've got somebody with their hand up, so then we'll go to that. But is there any concern for families directly north of Millennium Park? So homes along O'Brien, they said, for example, are on well water.
Yeah, so if you look in the map, you can see that the map that's up right now, you see that blue arrow that indicates the direction of groundwater flow. And so that's basically showing that groundwater is flowing, from north to the south. So the contamination or the impacts that you see south of the landfill, that's likely going to continue to keep moving south. You can kind of think of groundwater like a stream. The contaminants aren't going to flow upstream. If you drop a tennis ball in a stream, it's going to flow down. It's not going to flow up. And we have some confirmatory information with that sample north of the landfill, where we had only one detection of PFBS at 1.5 parts per trillion, which is extremely low. So that those two pieces of information let us know that there's not a concern north of the landfill, at least according to this information.
Great, thank you. That may have answered our attendee with her hand up, may have answered their question. So if you do have a follow-up question, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, I'm going to keep running through the question and answer box here. When did the investigation on site here begin? And then the second part of this question that I can remind you of is, so it kind of starts with that. And then when was the public notified?
The investigation, it's a little bit complicated. Eagle was trying to work with the landowners on the investigation to develop a plan to move forward with PFAS sampling. That didn't happen right away, so Eagle decided to step in and collect the information that was collected in December of 2021. And once we got those results, we shared them with the landowners and tried to work with them to develop a plan to continue working on this site. And what else am I missing, Mike?
Notification after that. So like when was you talked about notifying the local units of government. I think just the timing on when the first kind of work with the property, and then when actual notification went out to the local units.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we had a meeting with some of the local leaders in the area. So like the city of Walker, we had discussions with the Kent County Local Health Department, and we asked the we asked the group if they thought it was a good idea to have a meeting about this, and Eagle heard a yes to that. And so that's when we started to work on setting up a meeting to basically have this meeting to help share this information.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions about fishing in the lake. So the first one that we got is, I think, kind of a very straightforward question. Knowing that kids fish in the lake, should they find a new place to fish? Should they avoid fishing in this lake?
Thank you, Christine, for the question. So far, the levels of PFAS that we see in the lakes are very low. That doesn't mean that PFAS are not going to accumulate in the fish. The only way to know is by sampling the fish, something that Eagle did. So we have to wait for the results. If you have any concern about the lakes, Ndhs have a general guideline, a general fish guideline that you can use. You just have to go to the eSafe Fish webpage, and you have to follow the general guidelines. And that general guideline are for rivers and lakes that don't have their own guideline. Thank you.
But Rosa, I think it would be, excuse me, safe to say with the Grand River being so close to Millennium Park that they could probably take these guidelines from the Grand River and apply it to those water bodies as well. Okay.
Great, thank you. Have there been any reports of foam on the water, whether on the lakes or in that area of the Grand River?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I know our Water Resources Division has a foam reporting hotline, but I have not gotten any contact with them about that. So I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And so maybe what I would recommend there's a couple questions in here about that. Number one, if you are in the area and you do see foam, to report it, like Kent just said. But also, Kent, I'm gonna volunteer you here. Feel free to reach out and ask those specific questions. Like Kent said, he works in the materials management division. I work in kind of a liaison with our remediation and redevelopment division. We may not know the answer, but we can find somebody in water resources who can follow up with you. So feel free to reach out to Kent, myself. We'll find somebody who can answer that specifically for you. Are there any? Go ahead.
I'd be glad to talk to anyone, beyond this meeting. I'm always available. I always try to make myself as available as possible to answer any questions that people have. So I think my contact information is on the slideshow. So just feel free to reach out.
Good, thank you. Actually a question about the slide that's up right now. So there's one sample, it looks like, kind of per lake area here. Is that, do you think that that's adequate? Is there a plan for additional sampling? What are your thoughts on the adequacy of one sample per lake?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's something, we've approached the landowners with. One thing that's unique about this site is that it's the Grand River definitely has an effect on the site, meaning, in the springs or in the spring, when typically you get a lot more rain, the water levels rise, and so do the water levels in Millennium Park. In some cases, you can see a couple of feet of water level change in Millennium Park, depending on where you're at. So that's a question that we brought to the attention of the landowners about, potential seasonality. And then if they should be checking for PFAS concentrations, given the time of year, whether it's high water or lower water, summer, fall, winter, et cetera, that kind of stuff. So that's something we've been talking with the landowners about, and hopefully it's something that they'll consider doing.
Thank you. For kind of the current interaction with the park, with the water, do you know if there's any plans to have signage in the area to give the public a heads up that this is here?
I don't know. I think that'll be something that'll have to be worked out with Kent County Parks, since they are, the owner of this area. It would, and it depends on results too. Like Rosa was saying about the fish. If we would get some concerning information about the fish, we would want to make people aware of that. So at that point, we'd probably want to work with Kent County Parks and see if there's a possibility of getting signs up to let people know if they're fishing.
Great, thank you. For the couple maps that we've been kind of bouncing back and forth between, there's the question that's in the Q&A. I'm going to ask a separate question and then follow up with that. But the slideshow today, is that available to folks if we want to provide that as a follow-up? I'm getting head nods.
Yeah. So I can have our web team take the slideshow and PDF it, and then we can put a link on the MPART webpage for it so people can download it.
Good, perfect. That was going to be my follow-up, because I know that the question was about the website and just not seeing that information that's being presented here on the website. So that would be great.
Yeah, and some of that's too is that the surface water information is a lot newer than some of the other information. So it takes some time for the web pages to get updated, and so it'll get up there. Just be a little bit patient, and I'll check in to see when we can get that up there.
Great, thank you. What is the risk that contamination continues to flow south to the river and then to the river and beyond and downstream?
I think that's a very low risk. What we're dealing with is very shallow groundwater, meaning groundwater that's very close to the surface of the ground. And typically when you have a lot of surface water near your site, that groundwater is more than likely going to be going to venting into the surface water. And the surface water in the park, it all flows towards the Grand River. So the water that leaves the landfill goes into the lakes, and it'll eventually make its way into the Grand River, and then it'll follow the Grand River. So there's a very low risk of it going south of the Grand River, because the Grand River kind of acts like what we refer to as a hydraulic barrier, meaning like it kind of creates a wall for stuff to not get through it, at least at this location, this specific site location.
So maybe clarify, I may have asked that poorly. So the risk to getting to the river is high, but not past the river, right? So the risk of contaminated groundwater then getting to the river, it's very probable that might happen. What's then the risk to that system?
The risk to the surface water, or?
Yeah, and public health concerns as it gets into the river and kind of beyond.
Yeah, so the Water Resources Division, some of that data I have on this map right here. Water Resources Division did a Grand River watershed survey back in 2019, where they basically sampled. They had a lot of samples that they collected all over the Grand River and feeder streams, tributary streams into the Grand River. And they gave a really good idea of what concentrations of PFAS were in the Grand River and Grand River watershed. And then there is, like Rosa said, there's specific fish advisories that we have out there, so that people are aware of, how to eat safe fish. And then, Rosa mentioned about, the surface water contact with the skin, and how it's not easily absorbed through the skin. So since we don't have any concentrations that are above any criteria, that risk is low.
Great, thank you. Thanks for clearing up my mistake there. Why is it necessary for additional surface water samples to be collected if the current round of sampling that was conducted is all below criteria?
I think it goes back to the seasonality question. So in this specific location, like I mentioned, the Grand River has a big influence in the site. These samples that are on the screen were collected during the spring when the Grand River was probably flooding the Millennium Park area. And if you look on this current image, you can see how the values in the Grand River compared to Millennium Park are kind of in the same range of concentration. So it'd be good information to know that during the summer or a drier period where the Grand River doesn't have as much influence on Millennium Park, if those concentrations are less or if they're more. There's just a lot of fluctuation in there's some pretty good complexity to the hydrogeology in this area. So to take a look at this in a seasonality, to take a look at the seasonality would be a good idea in my opinion.
And let's clarify that just a little bit. Even if we were to see the Grand River have, I mean, there's going to be almost like a sloshing of a bathtub as the Grand River flows up its banks and then goes back down. So you're going to have that fluctuation over time. We wouldn't see, and I don't know that we've seen in any other sites, huge fluctuations in these concentrations based on just what we were seeing already in the Grand River, right?
You wouldn't expect so, but like I said, I mean, this system is very dynamic, meaning it changes rapidly. So, you know, there's a question mark there.
Which may lead to why we want some more sampling, right? Great.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, at this time, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So I want to thank Abby, Heidi, Rosa, and Kent for all of your communication here this evening and answering the questions and presenting the information. Again, I will sort of echo what Kent was saying, that all of the contact information is provided in this PowerPoint. What I intend to do is share the contact list, the attendee list with the team here. And so if there's any follow-up that they need to do while looking at the questions again that were sent in and some of the answers that were provided, they can send out a note to everyone. Like Kent said, we're hoping to put the PowerPoint up online. So continue to take a look at that, and we'll share information as we can as this develops. So unless there's any closing words from anybody on the panel there. Seeing none. Thanks again, everybody, for taking some time out of your evening to join us. Really appreciate it. And we will talk soon. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.